Thanks to Momi, and thanks very much for the invitation to talk to you today. Um, Today, I'm going to talk about a project I've been doing for the last year that's using digital modeling of archival data to reconstruct ancient Nile floods and settlement patterns in the Batn el-Hadja region of Sudanese Nubia. And let's see if I can, here we go. The project uses the very important archival records of the Sudanese government's archaeological salvage of Sudanese Nubia, or ASSN. This formed part of the vast UNESCO-sponsored Nubian salvage campaign that took place during the late 1950s and 1960s. This international campaign set out to survey, excavate, and in some cases salvage archaeological sites in the 550 kilometers of Nubia that would soon be lost beneath the Aswan High Dam reservoir. Before it was flooded by the reservoir, the narrow and rocky Batn el-Hadja had very limited agricultural land and was sparsely populated in modern times. The region is generally viewed as a rather barren gap between more productive areas of Lower and Upper Nubia, and as both a barrier and a contact space between different cultural groups. So you see here this point of view nicely summed up by William Adams in his very evocative Cold War description of the region as a granite curtain. By modeling past Nile flows, we can refine these views by reconstructing the effects of climate-driven changes in Nile flow over time. These changes would have created opportunities, but also constraints on people living in this marginal area. The results are also relevant for the much more populous areas of the Nile Valley nearby in Egypt and in Upper Nubia. In this talk, I'll first outline the methods I've used to reconstruct these now flooded landscapes and to model their ancient hydrology. I'll then compare these results to the archaeological record and share some early results. So this work's only possible thanks to the foresight of the salvage campaign organizers, particularly Bill Adams, who advocated for detailed aerial photography of Sudanese Nubia. The photos were originally meant to help identify sites, although Adams later noted that they weren't eventually used much for this, as most sites aren't very visible from the air. Instead, the photos are mostly used to accurately map sites found through ground survey. All of Sudanese Nubia to be flooded was photographed to at least 1 to 15,000 scale in November and December of 1959. And you can see some of the results pinned to the wall in this wonderful photo of the expedition's headquarters in Wadi Halfa. The ASSN archive includes aerial photos from Dal in the south to Jimay in the north, which is just above the Second Nile Cataract. As you can see here, the photos have enough overlap that we can use digital photogrammetry to create a digital elevation model, or DEM, of the 1950s land surface. This screenshot is from the photogrammetry software, and it shows the location of the aerial photos in blue and the reconstructed topography in black and white below. The model was then georeferenced using control points taken from modern satellite imagery and elevation points taken from a 30-meter global DEM produced by the Japanese Space Agency. The end result is a very high-resolution 2.5-meter DEM and a 40-centimeter orthophoto of the entire Batn el-Hadja, as it was in 1959. Some archaeological features are visible in the DEM. So, for example, you can see some of the mud brick bastions of Kuma Fortress down here on the bottom right, and that's the orthophoto of the same fortress on the top right. I also used Corona spy satellite imagery from 1964 to extend the DEM a bit further north across the Second Cataract. And this lets us incorporate ancient flood evidence from the important pharaonic site of Megissa. So we can verify the accuracy of the DEM by comparing elevation contours with known Nile and reservoir levels. To give you an idea of how much this landscape's changed since the reservoir filled, it's worth showing a few comparisons of the orthophoto and modern satellite imagery. So this shows Urinati in December 1959. And this is how the site looks today with Lake Nubia surrounding it. And this is the same for Ambacol Island, which is a little further upstream. So it's really a very different landscape these days, with only the very highest parts of the valley still above water. The next step was digitizing all of the sites recorded by the ASSN and also the many other missions who worked in the Batn el-Hajja, either as part of the Nubian salvage campaign or beforehand. A center point for most of the recorded sites was actually pushed through the aerial photographic print with a pin, which means that the sites can be located very accurately, usually to within about 5 meters or so. As you can see on the back of the print, the surveyors put the site number, and they also sort of put in a rough outline for some of the larger sites. Using the archival and published records, it's possible to locate around 1,500 sites, which date from the Paleolithic through to the end of the medieval period, which was the most recent time frame in the mission's remit. This map gives you an idea of the archaeological density of this landscape, especially of medieval sites, which are shown here in yellow, and which make up about half of the total, and also the Bronze Age Sea Group cultural horizon, which is shown here in purple. So with the landscape reconstructed and populated with ancient sites, the next step was modeling ancient Nile floods. I used free modeling software called HEC-RAS, which is produced by the US Army's Corps of Engineers, and it's usually used by civil engineers for mapping floodplains and building bridges and making sure things won't get flooded by very high floods. But simply, this software simulates how a given body of water will flow through a river channel and across its floodplains. In this case, the model's using the detailed DEM of the 1950s landscape as a topographic base. It's important to calibrate the models so that they accurately mirror real-world flows. Fortunately, we have access to very detailed records of the Nile from a gauging station at Kajnati, which is located near Asquith Island in the middle of the study area. So this is a rating curve from 1946, which was a year of a very high flood. And it shows the relationship between the river elevation on the left and the flow rate of the river in cubic meters per second at the bottom. This green line is the modeled flow, showing it matching reasonably well with the actual flow records. So I was also able to calibrate it using this really nice photograph of a flood from 1967. So I could match the very high flood in this picture with the model. And yeah, this is one of the last floods to go through the Batn el-Hajja before the lake formed. So with the model calibrated to real world flows, we can then simulate any flow we like, much higher than any historic records. And we can match those to evidence for ancient Nile levels. So the best evidence we have for ancient floods comes from the chain of Middle Kingdom forts located within the Batn el-Hajja. These massive mud brick buildings were mostly built during the 12th dynasty of the Egyptian Middle Kingdom in the early 2nd millennium BCE. They were partly built in response to the increasing power of the indigenous Kerma polity to the south and served multiple purposes, including controlling river traffic, trade, and population movement through this part of the river, whilst also embodying Egyptian authority at the edge of the empire. Many of these sites have quite complex histories well beyond their original foundation. These include multiple phases of reoccupation and cultural entanglement between Egyptian and Nubian people into the later 2nd and early 1st millennium BCE. All of these sites give us some evidence for ancient Nile floods, but the most detailed records come from the twin fortresses of Sema and Kuma at the southern end of the chain, which you can see in this nice watercolor on the right. At Kuma, there were around 15 in situ pharaonic flood inscriptions dating to the 12th and 13th dynasties of the Middle Kingdom. These were made by scribes who scratched a line into the bedrock to mark the flood's height and then labeled it with the pharaoh's regnal year. These inscriptions were visited and first published in the 1840s by the Prussian Egyptologist Karl Richard Lepsius. Lepsius also noted that some of these marks were up to 9.5 meters higher than any modern flood. This became known as the Semna problem and remained quite controversial well into the 20th century. Perhaps due to the undeveloped underdeveloped state of paleoenvironmental research at this time, many geologists and archaeologists did not believe that such a massive increase in Nile flow was possible during the later Holocene. Egyptologists were especially concerned by the apparent lack of evidence for such large and presumably destructive floods downstream in Egypt. Some researchers instead suggested that the river channel at Semna had eroded by 9 meters since the Middle Kingdom, or that the channel had been widened by an earthquake. The French Egyptologist Jean Lecoultre proposed that the pharaoh Amenemhat III had built a dam at Semna, thereby artificially raising water levels around the forts. Later geological studies largely ruled out any significant erosion, and the location of the fortress's river stairs shows that low Nile levels in the Middle Kingdom were about the same as the modern day. This means that only the summer flood has changed, not the riverbed itself. Meanwhile, most evidence for a dam can be reinterpreted as the results of natural processes. Crucially, none of these other theories can explain evidence for very high Middle Kingdom floods downstream of Semna, which I'll come back to in a moment. These Nile level inscriptions are really useful for hydraulic modeling because they give us a very precise flood height and sometimes also a calendar date. So the model suggests that the highest Middle Kingdom Nile level at Qumr, which is Amenemhat III's year 30 in around 1824 BCE, corresponds to a peak flow around 3.5 times greater than a typical modern flood. This is also more than twice the volume of the Great Flood of 1878, which was the largest in modern records. Meanwhile, the average of the 15 in situ flood levels from Qumr indicates flows about 3 times greater than the modern mean. As you can see, if I compare these two images, under these ancient conditions, the landscape at Semna would have looked very different with a wide network of channels activated. All 3 Middle Kingdom fortresses here remain just above the water, but Qumr is now situated on an island, and Semna South is only just connected to the mainland. About 20 kilometers downstream of Qumr and Semna, there's a single 13th dynasty flood inscription at Askut, which suggests flows just over 3 times the modern average, and this is very close to the average Middle Kingdom flow at Qumr. The remains of a stone boat landing stage were also recorded by Alexander Badawi, and this must have been intended for use at very similar flood levels to that of the inscription. So working at the nearby Middle Kingdom fortress of Shalfaq in the 1930s, the excavator Noel Wheeler also recorded 3 landing stages at 7, 14, and 18 meters above modern low Nile level. He also noted a lack of preserved mud brick below the 25-meter line, which he suggested was caused by flood damage. The 14-meter landing stage would already indicate a flood much higher than any modern example. The 18-meter level roughly matches the simulated flow at Askut with the Askut inscription. And I'm a bit more skeptical of his 25-meter limit because this would imply a flood around 5 times the modern average volume. And a flood this large would have probably destroyed the forts of Qumr and Askut, neither of which showed any evidence of flooding. As a side note, the number of very high landing stages at these forts is quite interesting. Most of the Batn al-Hajja would have only been accessible to outside boats during the summer flood, which is the only time that some of the cataracts in this area can be safely traversed by a boat. Because of this, the fortresses probably saw a lot of boat traffic during the annual flood and built these high landing stages accordingly. So let's move finally to the fort of Megissa in the far north of the study area. In the 1930s, Noel Wheeler, who again worked here, recorded evidence that brackets high floods around the fort's river stairs in the form of flood silts and preserved mud brick. And these are the floods in the model that would be necessary to reach those levels. He also noted a high boat landing stage at the small fortress of Davanati, which is opposite Megissa. as well as the elevated position of its mud brick walls relative to modern flood levels. When they restarted work at Megissa in the early 1960s, John Lakuta and his team excavated a sandstone boat landing about 4 meters above the modern high water level, which is just here. And this also showed signs of flood damage. Very interestingly, Lakuta's team recorded the destruction of the fort's lower mud brick bastions to a level of around 147 meters above sea level. And they believe this was caused by an abnormally high Middle Kingdom flood. They also thought, they thought this was definitely a Middle Kingdom flood because later buildings dating to this period were also constructed below this level. According to the hydraulic model, flooding to this level would need an implausibly large flood, around twice the volume of the highest Middle Kingdom floods recorded at Kumar. On the basis of the available records, I would suggest instead that these bastions were destroyed by a lower flood that either waterlogged these structures or undercut their foundations. This evidence is still very interesting because it gives us the only clear example of a Middle Kingdom mud brick structure in this region that has been destroyed by a flood. This suggests that at least one exceptionally high flood did occur at some point during the Middle Kingdom, and that this was much larger than the fort's builders had anticipated. This chart summarizes the Middle Kingdom flood evidence which is on the left, compared to the some modern summaries of Nile floods on the right. Each dotted line you see on the left is a dated Nile flood inscription, mostly from Kumar. And these dotted lines are the boat landing keys at some of the fortresses. Overall, the evidence from these sites points to a series of very high Nile floods over a period of at least 60 years in the early second millennium BCE. These high floods could, of course, have extended before or after this period, when no Egyptian scribes were actually present in this region to record them. Some archaeological evidence consistent with these very high floods has since been found in Egypt. This includes the elevated position of the Middle Kingdom town of Elephantine, as well as high-level destruction of buildings both here and at Memphis and Abu Ghalib. Other evidence for these floods comes from high Middle Kingdom lake levels in the Fayum. The cause of these floods remains uncertain, and there are two competing theories. The first suggests a brief wet phase in the headwaters of the White Nile, and this is evidenced by very high lake levels in East Africa around this time. The other theory argues for increased flows into the Nile's Ethiopian tributaries, which resulted from the northward movement of monsoonal rains. Beyond this Middle Kingdom evidence, there's also a lot of archaeological evidence from the region for flooding in sites of many different periods. In some cases, flood destruction or flood deposits are mentioned in the archaeologist site records, as in the first two examples here. The example on the left is especially useful because the flooding of this A group site, you can probably just see the A group levels here with Nile silt above it. We can tell that this flood must have happened before or during the C group, which is when this tomb was cut through the site. Also useful are sites that have clearly not been flooded, like this late Christian building on the right. In this case, the preservation of fragile mud brick shows that no later flood has ever risen higher than this. It's also worth mentioning that a lack of evidence for flooding doesn't necessarily mean the site was never covered by floodwaters. If sites were already buried, for example, they might not show any obvious evidence of flooding. Most of the survey work in this area took place in the late 1950s and 60s, early 60s, when radiocarbon dating was still a fairly new technology. Fortunately, some of the teams working here had some test samples dated, and these plots show the calibrated results from two sites within the study area. They're especially useful because the dated deposits are surrounded by Nile silts and therefore give us quite precise dates for episodes of flooding during the 7th millennium, in this case on the left, and during the early 5th millennium on the right. The location of datable sites near ancient Nile paleochannels in this area can also indicate minimum flood levels for a given period. So these C group sites, for example, are located next to two desert paleochannels. If we assume an arid climate similar to the present day, as we'd expect for this period, these areas were probably only good places to live when these channels themselves were flowing. Another type of evidence we have for high floods are the hundreds of river groins built across the Bab el-Hadja. Most of these walls were probably built to capture Nile silt for agriculture or to encourage plant growth for grazing animals. Most of these groins were still flooded by modern Nile levels. And in fact, we know from a bit further south in Sudanese Nubia, some of these walls were still being built about 50 years ago. But we also have examples at much higher levels, like these ones near Semna on the right. And these would have been activated at sort of almost over double the modern Nile flood average. So these structures are now impossible to date accurately, but they still indicate recurring high floods and efforts by local people to utilize them. Another more indirect clue for ancient flood levels comes from site elevations. These charts show the minimum flood volumes needed to reach the lowest site from each period. So you can see the thresholds here for the Neolithic and Kerma periods are quite a bit higher than those for the C group and X group and Christian sites on the right. By combining all of this archaeological evidence with flow simulations, we can sketch out a basic picture of long-term Nile flood trends. I should emphasize this is fairly preliminary still, and yeah, there's still a bit more analysis of the of some of these sites that needs to be done. This chart shows the modeled Nile flow needed to reach every dated site recording in the region. So each of these dots is a site, and this is the simulated flood needed to reach it. The box and whiskers sort of are there to give a general idea of the vertical distribution of the sites in each period. What we're especially interested in here is the lowest site of each period, which should bear some relationship to Nile flood levels in that time frame. This is clear if we zoom in to the lower part of this chart. We can assume that people generally aim to live close to the river while also avoiding flood risk. In theory, these lowest site elevations should therefore mark a level just above the highest expected flood. The reality is, of course, probably a bit more complicated. In some periods, for example, people may have camped seasonally in areas they knew would flood. Another challenge is that most sites have only been dated to cultural period. So the dots on this chart are therefore positioned in the middle of each period range, but could in reality date to any time within them. This could hide short and longer term changes in Nile flow within a given period. Because of this variation, the blue line I've drawn here probably only represents the minimum expected high flood for each period. Another important issue is whether we can use modern topography to accurately model floods in the distant past. Brief geological studies of this region were undertaken in the 1960s, and they suggest that throughout the early Holocene, the Nile was cutting down through Pleistocene alluvium to reach its earlier riverbed, which lies on very hard crystalline bedrock. Evidence from the Middle Kingdom fortresses shows that the bedrock riverbed, which has only eroded slightly until the present day, was reached by the early second millennium BCE at the latest. So around this time here. As you can see, some A group and C group sites are located only just above the modern floodplain. And this could mean that the Nile had actually cut down to the modern riverbed a bit earlier. This suggests that the flood model should be broadly reliable, at least from the end of the A group. On the other hand, the model is increasingly likely to overestimate Nile flow the further back in time we go, because the bed could have been much higher with silt. A final challenge with using archaeological sites as a proxy for Nile flow is that this method isn't very good at identifying longer term periods of low flow. This is because people were probably less likely to settle in areas they knew would flood in the future. Lower sites are also far more likely to be destroyed or buried by later flooding, so we may be missing them in the archaeological record. Because of this, it's useful to signpost some major historical periods of low Nile floods, most notably at the end of the Old Kingdom, the Egyptian Old Kingdom rather. This coincided with the global 4.2K event, when Egyptian texts describe mass famine and social disruption. Another major drop in flood levels occurred in the medieval period and was recorded on the rhodonilometer in Cairo. There are many other pharaonic, classical, and Islamic sources for Nile flow that also need consideration, especially as these often deal with relatively short periods that are largely invisible using the site dataset. So we can infer some more information about past flood trends by adding in evidence for sites that have been flooded or not flooded. This thin blue trend line follows the highest flooded site of each period. This should give us the minimum level of the actual highest floods that occurred during each period. Of course, this assumes that sites weren't damaged later, so we do need to be a bit cautious for periods that are followed by very high floods. So, for example, the C group here is followed by these very high floods in the Middle Kingdom, and the Meroitic period is followed by these high floods during the post-Meroitic period. Meanwhile, the lowest unflooded sites in each period should provide a limit for the very high flood levels. You may notice that in some of these periods, there's actually unflooded sites below flooded sites. And I think this is probably due to the low chronological resolution of these data sets. So in this case, the unflooded sites probably date a bit later than the flooded ones. Finally, it's worth adding the few relevant radiocarbon dated sites from this region. And these generally seem to match quite well with the site data. So you have this site excavated by the University of Colorado's expedition was unflooded, and it seems to be around the same, just above the level of these very high floods. Yeah, another site of theirs near Murshid had good evidence for flooding, and yeah, this does seem to fall within the this flooded area here. So, with all of those various caveats in mind, I'll just run through this chart very briefly. So the position of the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic sites suggests large but gradually receding floods. These patterns have also been noted elsewhere in the Middle Nile Valley and probably reflect greater rainfall over central and northern Sudan during the African humid period. As mentioned earlier, it's also possible that the earlier higher Nile riverbed may exaggerate some of these flow rates. We see a particularly large range of flooded sites in the A group period. And this could suggest extreme variations in Nile floods during this period. This pattern could also potentially reflect the downward riverbed incision during this time frame. The C group and the early to middle Kerma sites are generally a bit higher than the A group sites. A bit hard to see, but this yellow box you can see is a bit higher than the A group box here. Yeah, the levels of the flooded sites here also indicate substantial variation in flow across this time frame. Some cautions needed, as I mentioned, because some of these sites may have been damaged by later Middle Kingdom floods. At any rate, some floods during this period were definitely higher than the Paleo Channel level indicated here. Overall, this evidence suggests a return to relatively high floods after the low floods of the 4.2K event. As already discussed, Middle Kingdom sources provide the clearest record of sustained high floods during the Middle Holocene, and these are shown here by these black dots, which mark landing stages, flood inscriptions, and flood damage. Classic Kerma sites, just here, suggest that these high Nile floods dropped into the mid-2nd millennium BCE. New Kingdom sites suggest fairly consistent floods. You can see this cluster of flooded sites here, but nonetheless quite a bit higher than the modern average. Meroitic sites show a slight overall drop in flood levels, um, but they're still substantially higher. Um, I missed the Napatan period. Yeah, the sites from the Napatan period are too rare in the Bab el Hadja to really say much about floods, but evidence elsewhere points to generally low floods during this period. The Meroitic sites show a slight overall drop in flood levels from the New Kingdom, but possibly punctuated by one or two very high flood events, or one or more very high flood events, rather. The post-Meroitic X group and early Christian settlements occupy low river terraces, suggesting flood levels not far above the modern average. Damage to some X group sites suggests that one or more high floods occurred in this period. And most of the medieval sites have been destroyed by later agriculture, which makes it quite difficult to identify flood damage. At any rate, the intact late medieval mud brick buildings show that no flood since this period has exceeded this level here. Modern flow records from Aswan started around in the mid-19th century CE, and they show high floods trending lower into the 20th century, with notable high floods in 1878, 1946, 1988, and again in the last decade, including 2025, due to heavy rainfall linked to present-day climate change. After the mid-Holocene shift to hyper-aridity, human settlement in the Batn al-Hadja has depended largely on the Nile and its annual floods. As the floods subsided, the river irrigated fertile riverside silts, and these sustained wild plants for domestic animals and prey species, and also allowed the cultivation of crops and fodder. Across the Middle Nile Valley, flood volumes determine how much alluvial land is inundated. This makes them good indicators of past agricultural and pastoral potential. So this chart shows the extent of floodplain inundation under the reconstructed flood rates from a few different periods, with the modern average in green. In general, flooded areas in the Batn al-Hadja expand in line with flow rates, especially in reaches with the wide plains and paleo channels like Dal, Akasha, Saras, and also around the large islands highlighted here. This shows how the region's productive potential could have varied according to Nile flood discharges. It's important to note that the idea or the term productivity depends on a group's subsistence strategy and technology, and also to the reliability of the annual flood over different timeframes. So, for example, high floods that supported abundant wild plant growth would have benefited more mobile herders and hunters, while lower but consistent floods were far better suited to farmers relying on the wooden sagia water wheel. Nubian settlement history is often described as a series of ebbs and flows, with evidence for the near-complete abandonment of some areas at times. These shifts are often linked to extended periods of low Nile floods, or to socio-political factors such as conflict and state control. I hope this project will provide more detailed and localized environmental context to better inform these interpretations. This is particularly important for intercultural contact spaces such as the Saras Reach, where the modeling indicates a very different environment to the present day during the first half of the second millennium BCE. This reach probably more closely resembles the fertile seasonal channels we see today in places like Soleb on the bottom right. The dense concentration of C group and classic Kerma settlements and cemeteries here certainly suggests that this was a good place to live. Similar conditions also appear to have existed around the nearby pharaonic forts of Semna and Megissa. These environmental reconstructions may help contextualize interactions between the inhabitants of the pharaonic forts and the surrounding populations. For example, with indigenous C group communities probably well established in these fertile environments when the Batn al-Hadja forts were built, it seems likely that control over local populations is an important intended function of these structures. These models also provide useful context for interpreting these fortress communities' self-sufficiency, both before and after they fell out of Egyptian control. At a broader scale, it might be possible to suggest that the Batn al-Hadja was at times less of a barrier to intercultural interactions. This seems especially likely for periods such as the early second millennium BCE, when high floods meant that the area was probably able to support more intensive and contiguous occupation. With the modeling now complete, the next step will be a GIS analysis of site distributions relative to changes in floodplain productivity. This will be informed by what we know about different group subsistence strategies, technological adaptations, and wider historical contexts, as well as the broader paleoenvironmental and historical evidence for ancient Nile flow, including some of the sources listed in the second point here. This should give us a better idea of how variable Nile floods affected settlement patterns in this region since the end of the African humid period. Longer term, it would be very valuable to extend this methodology further into Nubia and Egypt. This would also allow comparisons with a much larger body of well-dated archaeological evidence and should help build a more detailed record of Nile floods over time. This modeling could also let us address some very interesting topics, like the wider impacts of these high floods on Middle Kingdom Egypt, and also the potential social effects of increasing naturally irrigated farmland in the Kerma heartlands during the first half of the second millennium BCE. Carrying out this kind of modeling in Upper Nubia and Egypt is in some ways relatively straightforward because we have modern GIS and geomorphological data available. Very briefly, I also wanted to show some of the archival materials that would allow the expansion of this research into Lower Nubia, which is also permanently flooded by the High Dam Reservoir. This includes these detailed maps of site locations from the West Bank Survey, which is held in the British Museum's Adams Archive, as well as these detailed World War II aerial photographs of Lower Nubia that I recently located in the United States. To wrap up for now, though, I hope I've shown how combining flood modeling with these important archival data sets can help us to disentangle the complex landscape histories and biographies of the Middle Nile Valley, as well as providing a valuable proxy for regional climate change. And I'll just finish by thanking a few people, especially the Sudanese and foreign staff of the ASSN, David Edwards for all of his help with this project, and also to the Wainwright Fund, the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and Wolfson College, Oxford for funding and hosting the project. And thank you all for listening.